So let's start here. I've learned many lessons over the course of my life, but one of the big lessons that I've learned is that no matter how hard I may try to make plans, something always seems to never quite go according to plan. Has anybody else ever experienced this in their life? Okay, I think it pretty much happens to everybody. Sometimes it's that appointment that you got to get to that's a big appointment for work. It's a big meeting, and so what do? Because you got to get there, you leave early, and you plan for the traffic, yeah? You plan for everything. You plan to get there like a half an hour early, but then as you're on your way to the appointment, all of a sudden that little tire light comes on your dashboard, and your car or your truck begins to pull to the right, and you got to pull off the road, and all of a sudden you got to screw in your tire. And you got to go to Discount Tire, and they can't patch it, so you got to get a new tire, and that takes 3 hours, and now not only have you not made it to the appointment early, you have to cancel the appointment altogether, because no matter how hard you may try to plan, it always seems like something happens so that things do not go according to plan. Or maybe it's that trip that you've been planning for a real long time. You've been squirreling money away, saving money because you're going to take the family vacation of a lifetime. You're going to go to that beach on that island, and so you're getting ready to buy the plane tickets, getting ready to book the hotel, when all of a sudden you begin to realize in your house, it feels a little hot in here. And you go outside and you realize your air conditioning unit has just broken down. And all of a sudden, all of that money is not going to the beach. It's going to your air conditioning, because no matter how hard you may try to plan, it always seems like something happens where things don't quite go according to plan. So a little while ago in our service, Pastor Kevin read a story from Matthew chapter 21. And this story, in its essence, is really kind of about plans. It's about plans that Jesus himself is making, but it is also about plans that people are making for Jesus. And as we're going to discover as we walk through and work through this story, especially for the people and their plans, no matter how hard they may try to plan, things don't seem to go quite according to plan. And so here's the story, Matthew 21, beginning at verse 1. Jesus and his disciples approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. And I want to pause right there, just kind of give you a little bit of context. Jesus and his disciples, they are on their way to the city of Jerusalem, and you need to know why they're on their way to the city of Jerusalem. They are on their way to the city to celebrate a festival, the festival of the Passover. Now, I've talked about this before. The festival of the Passover in ancient Jewish culture is kind of like our version of the 4th of July. It was the day when the ancient Jews would celebrate their independence, because over 1,000 years before, there was a man named Moses who led them out of a centuries-long slavery in Egypt across the desert to a place that we now call Israel. Back then, they called it the Promised Land. And so this was kind of Independence Day for the ancient Jews. Now, by the time you get to the 1st century in Matthew chapter 21, this festival of the Passover actually came with quite a bit of tension. Because in the 1st century, the ancient Jewish people were not being enslaved, but they were being occupied by the most powerful empire in the world in this day and age, the Roman Empire. And a lot of the ancient Jews living in Israel did not like it. And so every year when Passover rolled around, every year when they would celebrate their independence, sometimes there would be people among the Jews who would try once again to gain their independence from Roman occupation. And so sometimes there would be protests, sometimes there would be demonstrations. Every once in a while, there would even be a rebellion, a riot, or an attempted insurrection. And the Roman government didn't like this at all. In fact, there was this ruler of Rome. He was actually the governor of Judea. His name was Pontius Pilate. You may have heard of him before if you grew up in church. And every single year, during the week of the Passover, Pontius Pilate would actually plan a bit of a Passover parade. But it was a Passover parade to actually show the Roman government's power. He would come riding into the city of Jerusalem during the week of the Passover on his horse, on his steed, and he'd have the Roman army in tow with all of their cavalry, all of their horses, all of their steeds, all of their battles, all of their swords, all of their spears, all of their shields. They would have these golden emblems with golden eagles on it. That was the insignia of the Roman army. And the reason that Pilate would hold this parade every year during the week of the Passover is that Pontius Pilate kind of lived by this motto: an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And Pilate thought that if he could just show the power of the Roman army, that anybody who even thought about leading some sort of demonstration, protest, rebellion, or insurrection during Jewish Independence Day, they just wouldn't. Because they saw how quickly and how easily in this parade the Roman army could overpower their protest. Well, it turns out that this year, during this week of this Passover, Pilate isn't the only one who's planning a Passover parade. Jesus is too. Matthew 21, verse 1 again, Jesus sent two of his disciples, and he said to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you're going to find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." Jesus begins to plan his own Passover parade, and he takes two of his disciples, and he says, "Okay, I want you to go just a little bit ahead of me. Go to the budget donkey rental, okay? They got the fast break line right there, and you're going to find a mama donkey and her baby donkey. Just go, grab them. If anybody asks any questions, just say Jesus has a reservation, and they'll be all good with it." So that's what the disciples do. They bring back the donkeys for Jesus to ride on, and Jesus begins to plan his parade. But his parade, in a lot of ways, if you just pause to think about it, is a little weird, isn't it? Here's why. Anybody in here ever been to a parade before? Anybody? Okay. If you've ever been to a parade, how many parades have you seen with a dude on a donkey? Anybody ever seen that before? Okay. If anybody's riding something in a parade, this is not a trick question, okay? It's the same in the 1st century and the 21st century. What do they usually ride? They usually ride a horse, right? Yeah, that's what they usually ride. That's just kind of standard fare for parades. That's what Pilate rode during his Passover parade. So why in the world would Jesus ride something like a donkey? Well, it turns out that Jesus is not only planning a parade, he's also fulfilling a prophecy. Because about 550 years before Matthew 21, there's this Old Testament prophet. His name is Zechariah. And Zechariah writes about a king who will one day come to the people and to the nation of Israel. And in verse 9, he writes this about this coming king. "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious." But Zechariah continues and he says his victory is going to look a little lowly because he's going to be riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so here's Jesus planning his parade. And at the same time, he's also working to fulfill a prophecy about a king who will come to Israel on a donkey. Now, the people who turn up and turn out for Jesus' parade, they actually get the symbolism. It's not lost on them. They know Zechariah 9, verse 9, and when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, they begin to get real excited. Matthew 21, verse 8, a very large crowd gathers, and they spread their cloaks on the road. You've heard of like rolling out the red carpet for dignitaries before? That's exactly what they're doing with Jesus. But not only that, they actually cut branches from the trees, and they spread them on the road too. In fact, the gospel writer John, he says the branches that they cut from these trees are palm branches, which is why we call today in the church year Palm Sunday. But the palms actually have a very special and very significant meaning. And in order to understand the palms, you got to go back about 200 years. Because about 200 years before Matthew 21, the nation of Israel was being occupied. But this time they weren't being occupied by the Romans, they were being occupied by the Greeks. And 200 years before, there was this Greek ruler. His name was Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And that's a weird name, but here's what you need to know about this guy. He was a bad dude. He treated the ancient Jews horribly. In fact, at the pinnacle of his terror, he actually went into the temple in Jerusalem and he slaughtered a pig on the altar there. Now, if you know anything at all about Jewish kosher dietary restrictions, you know that is absolutely insulting and awful. Not only that, he as the Greek ruler didn't just occupy the nation of Israel, he actually persecuted the Jews. He killed many of them, he tortured many of them, he was mean to all sorts of them. Well, finally, in the middle of all this occupation and all this persecution, there was this Jewish priest. His name was Judas Maccabeus, and he had enough. And so he actually led and staged a rebellion against the Greeks in Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and you know what happened? He pulled it off. He actually helped the ancient Jews gain their independence from the Greeks. And when he did, they celebrated with a parade. And you know what they laid right at his feet? Palm branches. In fact, one of the side benefits of gaining your independence is you get to mint your own money. And so when Antiochus IV Epiphanes led his protest, and when he pulled it off, the ancient Jews began to mint their own coins. Here's what these coins looked like during this era. Does that look familiar? It's palm branch. The palm branch for the ancient Jews became a symbol of freedom and independence, victory over Israel's enemies. And so when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, everybody's ready. And they're thinking in the back of their minds, okay, Jesus, just like Moses freed us from our slavery to the Egyptians, just like Judas Maccabeus freed us from our oppression by the Greeks, now it's time for you to free us from our occupation to the Romans. You get this done. In fact, they say in verse 9 of Matthew 21, the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed, they all shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. A little bit of technical work here for you. The word Hosanna is actually an ancient Hebrew word made up of two different parts, Hosha and Na. Hosha means salvation, Na means now. And so the people are shouting to Jesus, save us now. Get this done. We're laying before your feet some palms. And you know what, Jesus? You got the power because you got the favor of the people. We're at your side. Let's get rid of these Romans. Save us now. That's the plan. But it's a funny thing about plans. Things don't always go according to plan. No matter how hard you may try to plan. In fact, back to that prophecy from Zechariah 9. Zechariah 9, verse 9, rejoice greatly, daughter Zion, shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you righteous and victorious. When the people of Israel in the first century read that prophecy, they thought they knew what it meant to be victorious. Here's what it meant. It meant to gain the upper hand. It meant to get power. It meant to overpower the Roman army and the Roman government. But it's funny because if you keep on reading just one more verse, that's not what victory in Zechariah 9 looks like at all. Because in verse 10 of Zechariah 9, God speaks, and God says, when this king, who's going to be righteous and victorious, when he comes, I'm going to take away chariots from Ephraim. You know, chariots, the stuff you ride into battle, to win a battle. Ephraim's the hill country in the north of Israel, and God says, I'm going to take all those chariots away. You're not going to win anything by riding chariots. And not only that, I'm going to take away the war horses from Jerusalem. And not only that, there's not going to be a single arrow that is fired for this victory. The battle bow is going to be broken. In fact, here's what this king is going to do. He's going to proclaim peace to the nations. Rather than gaining victory with brute force power, this king is going to bring a victory that comes with a proclamation of peace. Now, let me tell you, that's not what anybody in Matthew 21 had in their plans. Let me ask you a question. What is it that happens in you when things don't go quite according to your plan? How do you feel? How do you respond? How do you react? I can tell you how I tend to react. Maybe the same is true of you too. When things don't go according to what I have planned, you know what I tend to try to do? I tend to try to power through so that I can make all my plans and all my dreams come true. Maybe you do too. You know how this works. You're walking along one day when all of a sudden you trip and you fall and you land flat on your face. Is that in anybody's day planner? Does anybody have that kind of thing planned, right? And as soon as you fall flat on your face, the first thing you go is, ow, right? The second thing you think is, I hope nobody else saw that, because that's kind of embarrassing. And then the third thing you do is you get up as fast as you possibly can, right? And what do? You just try to go walking like nothing happened. Of course, you know, your leg hurts and your knee hurts and your hip hurts and your back hurts and your elbow hurts and your shoulder hurts. But what do you think? I can just walk it off. Because when things don't go according to plan, that's what you do. You just try to power through to make everything you have dreamed of come true. Of course, then the next week you're at the doctor with all sorts of aches and pains because it doesn't actually work. Or how about this one, okay? Maybe if you have little kids at home, mom, dad, you ever tried to put your kids to bed early? You have a plan. Does that ever go according to plan? They're going to be in bed by 7, right? We're going to get them bathed. We're going to have their hair combed. We're going to get their teeth brushed. It's going to be a delightful evening, just my spouse and me. By 8:30, 9 o'clock, you know who's still not in bed? The kids. And when things don't go according to plan and you don't know what to do, what do you start doing? You start trying to power through. Your voice gets raised, your fist gets high, and your threats loom large. Let me ask you another question. When things don't go according to plan and you just try to power through, how well is that working for you? And even if it works, because every once in a while it does, how long does your success actually last? You know, when I was a kid, on the mantle above the fireplace in my house, there stood a symbol of power. You know what it was? It's this. Anybody else have this symbol of power in their house? Now, actually, more often than not, it was a symbol of my father's power, okay? Because, you know, when I was a kid, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and so she was responsible for me and my brother and my sister, and we were all kind of born close together, and things would get a little out of control in our house. And so sometimes she'd take this spoon right off the mantle, but a lot of times, more often than not, what she would do, okay, is she would just point over there to the mantle when we got unruly, and she'd say, just wait until your father gets home. And we knew at that point that we were in trouble because this was a symbol and an implement of power, right? Right on our hands or right across our backside. Well, one day, it was the middle of summer break. My mother takes us 3 kids shopping to Kmart. You guys remember Kmart? Okay, and so she goes to the clearance rack because she's trying to look for some clothes for herself, for us kids. And right behind the clearance rack, there is this big white door. It has a crash bar on it. I still remember this. I'm like 6 years old, okay? And on the door, there's a big red sign, and it has white lettering on it. And here's what the sign says. I figured this out a little bit later after this episode. It says, emergency exit only. Alarm will sound. And so my mom's there at the clearance rack, and she's like, looking at clothes for us and for herself. And I say to my mom, hey, Mom, what's that door? Can I go out it? And she says, oh, no, you can't. That's the emergency exit. If you try to walk out of that door, there's going to be this big alarm that goes off in the store. And then she turns her back to the door, and she starts looking at clothes again. And I got to tell you, even though she had said that to me, that big red sign was kind of like a beacon, drawing me to it, tempting me, enticing me, making me wonder what would happen if I just a little bit cracked open that door. And so I walked to the door, and I began to press in on the crash bar of that door just a little bit. And I kid you not, that door didn't open a millimeter. When I heard the loudest siren I have ever heard in my life to this day, there was a siren that was blaring. There were actually lights in the store that were flashing, and these were not blue light specials at Kmart, okay? These were the bad kind of lights. And a voice actually came over the intercom, and the voice said, I wish I was making this up, but I'm not. Emergency door opened. Please evacuate the store. And everybody in Kmart has to leave. My mom realized what had happened. She drags me by the ear out of the store, and as soon as she gets me into the parking lot, she says to me, just wait until your father comes home. Well, we finally get home, and I get banished to my room for the afternoon, and my dad, it seemed like an eternity, but he finally gets home. And I can hear him and my mom kind of talking outside the door, and then I watch the doorknob on my door begin to turn, and my door begins to open. And when he walked into my room that day, I can tell you what I expected. This. Because causing an evacuation of Kmart was not in my mother's plans that day, right? I expected a raw display of power. But actually, when my dad walked into the room, he walked into the room like this. And he came to me, and he wrapped his arms around me, and he gave me a big old bear hug, and he said to me, now Zachary, you really need to listen to your mother when she tells you not to open the door. You also need to go apologize to her. Because what you did wasn't right. But I also know that really scared you. And I just want you to know that everything is still going to be okay. You see, my dad, when he could have reached for power, instead with a bear hug opted for peace. And when he told me everything was going to be okay, that's a piece that I still remember to this very day. You know, when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, you know what he's really doing? He's actually messing with everybody's plans. He's messing with Jewish plans because what they want from Jesus is for him to come riding in and to throw out the Romans. But he's also messing with Roman plans. Because even a hint of a guy who might lead a little protest, a little rebellion, or anything like that just freaks him out. And so when Jesus starts messing with everybody's plans, you know how they respond to Jesus? They respond to Jesus with power. In just a few days, on that Thursday, his Jewish enemies, they arrest him. And they drag him off to a trial where they bring all sorts of false charges against him. In fact, eventually, Jesus winds up in the court of the very man who just earlier that week had led a Passover parade of his own, Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate winds up sentencing him to death on a cross. And here's where the Romans come in, because they are happy to stamp out and snuff out even a hint of a man who might just lead a rebellion. When Jesus messes with plans, here's how everybody responds. With power. They're just going to power through because, after all, there's nothing else you can do. And yet, it's a funny thing, because when Jesus is on the cross, he doesn't respond to all that power with just more power. He responds just like the king in Zechariah 9, verse 10. In fact, one more prophecy for you. This one from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. Isaiah says, there's going to come a king who's going to be pierced for our transgressions. He's going to be crushed for our iniquities. There's going to be a punishment on him that brings us what? Peace. And by his wounds, we're going to be healed. Here's the reality. God knows a little something about messed up plans. Because God had a plan that got messed up. You know who messed it up, right? We did. Because when God first created the heavens and the earth, he had a plan of righteousness and beauty and holiness and glory and grandeur and wonder. He had a plan of perfection, and then we messed it all up with sin. And it was at that point that God had a choice to make. How is he going to respond? You know, he could have responded, and we would have deserved it. We would have deserved it with the divine version of the wooden spoon, right? Fire and brimstone. When your plans get messed up and you don't know what to do, you just power right through. Power right over people. But instead of responding like this, he responded like this in Jesus. Because when Jesus stretched out his arms on that cross, he gave us a promise that in place of our sin, we were going to receive righteousness. In place of the messed up plans that we had created for God, everything was still going to be okay. And you know what? That peace is still changing lives to this very day. So let me just ask you one more time. What is it that happens in you when things don't go according to what you have planned? Which one are you going to choose? Power or peace? Here's another way to think about it, okay? Pontius Pilate, when he had his Passover parade, that was a parade of power. Jesus' Passover parade was one apiece. Which parade are you going to march in? Choose wisely. Happy Palm Sunday. Let's stand for closing prayer.